On Thursday morning, Dr. Karen Suskind, who is live with us today as part of this service, and I were in this sanctuary at 8:15, and we were co-officiating a Brit Milah, a bris, a circumcision ceremony. And this morning, we got to welcome this beautiful, beautiful new baby into community. And I cannot tell you how filled my heart is with those two births that came at this particular time. When I came into the sanctuary on Thursday morning, and when I saw Karen, I immediately felt lifted, as I always do when I see Karen. But when Karen and I work together, it's always to celebrate life, which is such a blessing and such a joy. But even so, of course, like everybody, I was carrying so much heaviness, so much sadness, so much grief, so much anger and rage, and all of the things that we've all been feeling this week. I thought, how can I get into a mode where I can be co-officiating this Brit Milah at this time? How am I going to get to that place? How am I going to lift myself out of all of these emotions that I'm feeling? Having spoken in the week to congruents like Karen and Jill and Gabe and others who live in that South Boulder community, who knew between us as a community, at least 4 of those 10 were people known and loved directly by people. Jody was the best friend of the sister of one of our beloved members, and also played tennis with Jill. Denny was known by others. I've spoken to somebody who was very close with Officer Eric Talley, and the stories we hear about this public servant who just cared so deeply about the community, who was a father of 7 children, who was actively looking for a safer job. These stories are so painful. And I was carrying these stories, and I was carrying the collective grief that we, just in our little Bonnet community, and then in the wider Boulder community, and of course the South Boulder community, have all been feeling. And I walked in carrying all of that into the sanctuary on Thursday morning, thinking, how am I going to get beyond this? And then you know what happened? And Karen can confirm this, I think. It was literally the most joyful Brit Milah I've ever attended in my life. It was literally the most joyful Brit Milah I have ever attended in my life, and I've been to a few. Because there was this collective sense like we needed it. We needed to celebrate life. We needed to make that transition and mark that transition. And what happened was, there were quite a few of us in this room, masked, of course. I think all of us in the room, apart from the baby, were either fully or partially vaccinated. And we were, as much as possible, keeping our masks on and keeping safe distance. But, you know, Karen, as always, did the most beautiful, beautiful, holy job in carrying out the ritual part of the circumcision and sharing words from her beautiful heart. And I shared some words about the importance of celebrating birth and rebirth. And then once the circumcision was over, once the bris was over, and I started singing, as I did this morning, for Lila, started singing Simon Tov, or Mazel Tov, and Simon Tov, thinking like, am I even going to be able to get those words out of my mouth? As soon as I started singing it, the family just spontaneously took each other's hands and started dancing around in a circle in the middle of the sanctuary. And we sang it probably 4 times through Simon Tov, because there was this feeling. And as this started happening, I thought, this is the first time I have been in physical proximity with a group of people dancing for well over a year. And it was beautiful. And I felt tears welling up in my eyes. And of course, they were tears of sadness and grief, but they were also tears of great joy and tears of a possibility and a hope of what is coming for us. I share that story because it feels incredibly relevant to where we are in our hearts and where we are in our souls right now, but also where we are in our calendar. Because tonight we're going to start Pesach. This is Shabbat HaGadol. Shabbat HaGadol, when it falls like this, is a kind of strange phenomenon because, as I mentioned last week, Normally, the rabbi on Shabbat HaGadol would give a whole thing like, what is chametz? What is matzah? How do you clean your house? What do you have to get rid of? What do you not have to get rid of? I'm not doing any of that. Like, if whatever we've done at this point, we've done, and whatever we haven't done, we haven't done. And like zeu, like everybody is in their own journey with this. I have no feelings about it. But what I do want to say is something about what it means to sit down at a Pesach table, what it means to sit down at a Seder. I fully am aware that some of us are going to be sitting on our own. Hopefully, at least if we're sitting on our own, we'll be zooming in with family members. Some of us are going to be sitting in small groups. Some of us are going to be with our families. But whatever our configuration might be, tonight is Seder night. And one of the things that happens at Seder night is it's the only time traditionally where as part of the Seder, we say Hallel. We say Hallel. Hallel is one of the 15 steps of the Seder. What is Hallel? Hallel is a set of psalms that are all about redemption and celebration and transformation and reconciliation and just the jubilation and the triumph of having survived slavery. But we say it at night. And the tradition of the Leil Seder is imagining ourselves actually still in Mitzrayim. When we start the Seder, we are imagining that we are still in Mitzrayim. And so there's a debate, as there so often is in the Talmud, between Hillel and Shammai about how much of Hallel should we actually say at night? Because we haven't actually been redeemed. So how can we sing psalms of redemption? And Shammai says we should only say the very first bit before it talks about B'tzeit Yisrael, before it talks about the exodus from Egypt, before it talks about the actual leaving of Egypt. We only do the first part because we're not there yet. We're still in our place of slavery, of degradation, of deprivation, of humiliation. So how can we sing a fully embodied psalm, set of psalms that are about redemption? And Hillel says no. Hillel says no. We sing the whole thing. We sing the whole thing. We sing all of it. Why? Because they're about vision. They're not about reality. They're not about hindsight. They're about what we are dreaming of in the future, and what we're dreaming of in the future, as we learn instructively from Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, is about redemption, about looking forward to something else. And so there is something so profound about that, because what Hillel is saying is even in the depth of the night, Leil Seder, in the middle of the night, when it's dark and we're feeling despair and hopeless, we still get up and we sing. And it's connected because Hallel, the first part of Hallel anyway, if you're following in a traditional Haggadah, the first part of Hallel comes with the Kos Sheni, the second cup. And the second cup is the cup of redemption. It's the cup of redemption. And there is a bracha that we say that accompanies the second cup that finishes with exactly the same bracha as the blessing right before the Amidah that says, Ga'al Yisrael. Blessed are you, God, who has redeemed Israel, in the past tense. And so the commentators say, how can we say Ga'al Yisrael? How can we say, bless God who has redeemed Israel, when we are so far from redemption? When we right now are so far from redemption, how can we say Ga'al Yisrael in the past? We're not redeemed yet. Again, it's about vision. But there's something else. There's an incredibly beautiful teaching by Rebbe Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, the Hasidic Rebbe, the student of the Baal Shem Tov, who is a distant relative of Jack and Sarah Sheckman Gabriel. And Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev says like this. He tells a story. And in order to understand the context of the story, I need to explain the whole concept of a bracha levatala. A bracha levatala is an unnecessary blessing, or a negative blessing. And the whole concept of it is, if you say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, ba 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 ba, you say a blessing, and then you're not actually doing whatever action is associated with the blessing. It's like you're bringing in the energy, so to speak, of God's name without actually manifesting what it is you're saying the blessing for. And this is thought to actually be a violation of the Ten Commandments, because in the Ten Commandments, the third blessing says, don't take God's name lashav, in vain. And one of the ways in which the rabbis understand taking God's name in vain is to say the words of a blessing without fulfilling the action. So that's the context of the story. So here's the reality. A boy is sitting, could be a girl, a child, a young child, let's say, is sitting at a table, and in front of them is a big plate of cookies. Maybe they're kosher for Pesach cookies, I don't know. But a big plate of cookies, right? Sitting in front of this child. And the child really, really wants to eat a cookie. It's a good child, is not just going to randomly eat the cookies. And then suddenly, knowing that they don't actually have permission to eat the cookies, just suddenly says, they say the blessing that you would say for a cookie. And so the parent of the child is like, they just said the bracha, I have to give them a cookie. And give them the whole plate of the cookie. And so Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev says that's what it is when we say Ga'al Yisrael. We're saying, blessed are you, God, who has redeemed Israel. And so God, as it were, looks down on us like God's children and says, I better redeem Israel right now. In the same way that the child gets the cookie, right? I love that teaching. I love that teaching. It's such a powerful story. And so we know we're so far from being redeemed, as we go into Pesach with such heavy hearts after this week that we've lived through. And as I've been feeling and as I've been saying to people, it feels like a trauma on top of a trauma, on top of a trauma, on top of a trauma. You know, we're already traumatized from COVID-19. Some of us are still feeling traumatized from January the 6th. There's other, you know, we're traumatized by what this country feels like in so many different ways, what the world feels like in so many different ways. And then, as if that wasn't enough, we get this just heartbreaking tragedy in our own city. Rabbi Aviva Richman, who is becoming such an important teacher for me. She's one of the Roshei Yeshiva, she's one of the heads of Hadar, which is the egalitarian yeshiva in New York City, where Hannah Kapnick Ashara is studying to become a rabbi. And this is how Aviva Richman begins an article where she's talking about singing the Hallel. And she's talking about the experience of Mitzrayim. She says, imagine being shut up in your home as destruction rages beyond your doorstep. There is a plague, there is confusion, a nation is being torn apart. She's talking about the experience of the Israelites being in their homes. And of course, she's saying this scene of Pesach Eve in Egypt resonates all too closely to home this year as we're experiencing all those things, the plague, the destruction, and a country that's being ripped apart in a certain way. And from that context, she then teaches what I just taught about Hillel and Shammai having a difference of opinion about saying Hallel. And in the end, it goes along with Hallel, as it so often, with Hillel's Hallel. Hillel's Hallel is we say the whole Hallel. By the way, a teaching as why, because some of you know that we say the full Hallel on the first 2 days of Passover, of Pesach, and then the last 6 days, we actually only say what's called the half Hallel, where we omit some of the Psalms. And one of the teachings is based on the same Midrash, where the angels start celebrating after the splitting of the sea, of the Reed Sea, which is part of our Exodus story, of course. And that famous Midrash, which I'm sure you all know, where God says, how can you sing and dance when some of my creation are being drowned in the sea? Referring, of course, to the Egyptians who are drowning in the sea. And so there's a teaching that actually the reason we temper our Hallel in the last 6 days is not because of our own tragedy, because in the last 6 days of Pesach, we're actually moving towards the full redemption, because on the 7th day of Pesach is when we traditionally are seen to have actually crossed over the sea. But even as we move closer to redemption, we temper our celebration because we recognize that those around us have suffered. And we don't celebrate that. But, Hillel's teaching is so profound. Even in the midst of the night, even in the midst of the darkness, even in the midst of the pain and the sorrow and the despair, we sing with a sense of vision of what's possible and what's going to come. And the idea that built into the fabric of the Seder, when we tell this story, is the whole of Hallel. And we sing the whole of Hallel. And we don't sing it in a subdued, kind of like apologetic way. We sing it with a fullness of heart because we are anticipating something different. We're anticipating a redemption. When we come to the Maggid section, of the Seder, which is where we tell the story, what is sacred storytelling? You know, I imagine cultures and traditions throughout time sitting around fires telling sacred stories. We tell the sacred stories of our tradition. And what the rabbis in the Talmud agree, and especially in the dispute between Rav and Shmuel, is that the story should always begin with ganut, which is degradation, humiliation, subjugation, slavery, despair, and it should end with shevach, with praise. We begin with ganut and we end with praise. And that's how we tell the story. The story ends in a place of celebration and praise, but it begins by recognizing that all of the trauma that we have suffered as a people and as a civilization, it's embedded in us. And we know that. We know that physiologically and emotionally and spiritually, that trauma gets embedded into us, into our DNA. We even inherit trauma from previous generations. The whole research project of Rabbi Tirza Firestone and her book, From Wounds to Wisdom, where she talks about ancestral trauma and the fact that people can actually be living out patterns through their genetic codes, through their DNA from ancestors that died 2 generations before they were born. Ganut, shame is another word, shame, ganut. And what's interesting about the word ganut is it's exactly the same word that's used when the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, when it's talking about Shabbat, talks about whether you can bring your weapon into a synagogue on Shabbat or whether you should leave it outside. And eventually the halakha comes down to the fact you should definitely leave it outside. Why? Because a weapon is something that is connected to ganai, to shame, it's not a badge of honor. And my point in these words of Torah that I'm sharing today are not, I don't want you to be left with the idea that this is a sermon about gun violence in a general sense, although it is in part. But like the idea that according to rabbinic tradition, the idea that a weapon is a symbol of shame, not a symbol of pride, I think is really worth taking into consideration. You know, the fact that we are in the state that we are as a country with the impossible nature of a stuck Congress and Senate that is seemingly unable to pass sensible legislation, and the fact that we have so many people in this culture who want to make assault weapons not a symbol of shame, not a recognition of the number of lives that have been taken by them, but a symbol somehow of like a pride and a badge of honor, to me is just disgraceful. And something has to change. Something really, really has to change, you know. I understand the legal complexities of thank you, Larry Cohen and others who've helped me understand the legal complexities of what seemed at first to me horrific, that a county judge ruled that the city of Boulder's vote to ban assault weapons could not be upheld. I understand that that's complex legally because it's a clear state law that can't happen. And so a city cannot independently, apparently, rule something that the state has made legal. I get that, but what I don't get is just the continuing stuckness that we have in this country to make reform. I really wasn't planning to talk about this. I'm going to stop talking about that. I'm going to go back to talking about something else now, although I think it's really important, and I think we should think very carefully about it, about how we as a community engage in these issues, because it's very real. It doesn't bring anybody back, but it could prevent future tragedies like this. I want to end by talking about something that's connected to the Parsha. This Parsha that we read, apart from the fact that it talks about chametz and matzah, which is interesting in itself, and the way it's talking about the mincha offering, and the fact that you can't burn chametz on this fire. And we, by the way, we had an amazing bonfire yesterday morning. We burnt a lot of chametz. A lot of people came with bags full of bagels and pita bread and all the rest of it, and we burned it on that fire. And fire, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk last week, is such a powerful symbol of purification and transformation. And one of the verses towards the beginning of this parsha, from the section that we didn't read, it says, Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach lo tichbei. Eish tamid. There will be a perpetual fire, an eternal fire that will always burn on the mizbeach, on the altar, and it will never go out. A perpetual fire that will always burn on the altar, and it will never go out. We know from so many mystical texts, especially in the Hasidic tradition, that the mizbeach, the altar, is our own hearts. And however grieving we might be, however sad and angry we might be, the idea that we have a fire that burns in our hearts, a fire that cannot go out, a fire that sustains us, a fire that holds us together as a community, a fire that can be a fire of passion and love and commitment and loving kindness, a fire that is committed to the continuation of spiritual practice, of Jewish calendar, of Jewish life in Boulder and beyond, is so important. And I think it's that Eish, that fire, that Eish Tamid, that eternally burning fire that perhaps Hillel had in mind when he said, even when life feels absolutely at the lowest possible place, when we are literally in the pits of darkness, when we are at night and, the darkest part of the night, even then, says Hillel, we sing the Hallel, and we sing the full Hallel, because we have hearts of vision, hearts with fire in it. As Rabbi Aviva Richmond says, even if this year we have felt very stuck, on this night we sing a song that will ultimately fuel our march out of Egypt. We sing a song that will fuel our march out of Egypt. We sing a song that will fuel that fire that burns in our own hearts. Yes, the lives of 10 beautiful people, each with their own story, each with loved ones who are desperately mourning them. Those fires have gone out, and it is tragic, and it is painful, and it fills us with grief. But you know what? On Thursday morning, we had a Brit Milah. This morning, we celebrated a Simchat Bat, a baby naming of a beautiful new life. Pesach is all about the possibility of rebirth. So many of the symbols of the Seder are about rebirth, imagining what it's like to be reborn as we enter into the spring, as we enter into new life everywhere. As I hear outside the window right now, birds singing, and that hope that they bring. And with that hope, we sing Hallel. We sing Hallel into the night, knowing that the sun will rise again and that there will be morning. And it doesn't mean we stop grieving, and we honor the memories of those 10 souls, of Eric and Jody and Lynn and Denny and Ricky and Suzanne and Trelona and Terry and Kevin and Nevin. We say their names, we honor their memories, but we don't allow the tragedy to put out the fire that is burning on the altar of our hearts. Shabbat Shalom.